Howdy, howdy. Welcome to my tiny corner of the internet again. Yeah, for some reason, previous videos have been popping off pretty well. I can't complain. You know, it looks like there was a good discussion in my chat. Of course, you always get your 20% people who are just going to kind of complain about that sort of stuff. Right. But I wanted to open up a discussion about the topic of power. And this is kind of more of a vague talking point more than it is anything concrete. It's kind of more of a philosophical one, if you want to call it that, even though I'm not really a philosophical guy. I just like to talk about ideas. Is that power? I mean, I don't know if any of you have grown up in a religious background, a Christian background. Oftentimes, even with the founding fathers of the United States, you hear, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And at one point or another, you probably heard some kind of variant of that. And so, you might be familiar with, certain mythologies like George Lucas's Star Wars, where, the Sith are these passionate, power seekers, and the Jedi are these balanced, mellow people that are in tune with nature and all that sort of stuff. Very, the Sith are obviously the bad guys, within the context of that storyline and that mythology. Within the Bible, Lucifer is considered the fairest angel of them all, the most beautiful one, the most powerful of the archangels. And, his fall was because of his pride and his arrogance. And so, it goes to show that, there's a common theme within multiple works, they could talk about even like the founding fathers of the United States, carried this idea, is that, power is something that is this corrupting essence that just basically drains people. And from a pedestrian point of view, it feels like that's the case. From a surface level point of view, it seems like power is just something that is just this corrupting force, and that nobody really should have power. But that's kind of the funny part. I always feel like the people who have power always tell the normies, you shouldn't have powers because it's bad for you, kind of thing. And so, everybody else has to morally give it up, but the people who are in the know-how, that know it's bullshit, don't care. They just kind of socially get the normies to yield power towards them. But the thing is that, like, I remember when I was working a minimum wage job, my first job when I was, my first actual real minimum wage job when I was in high school, working at a fast food restaurant. There was a person I used to work with, and, they were really cool. I'd be working, pretty late in the evenings because second shift or whatever, right? And, every time we'd hang out, we would be working the same shift. We'd talk a lot, it'd be, we would be working in the kitchen, setting things up. And we just talk about life and ideas, and they're a really cool person and all that sorts of stuff. I really enjoyed their company, I enjoyed working with them. That was until they became manager. When they got the manager role, they became an entirely different person. It's like, they became petty, they became vindictive. It's like, everything was a power trip for them. And, they all of a sudden loved to push people around and threaten to write people up. It's like, all of a sudden they became an entirely different person. They became intoxicated with power to some degree. And you're just kind of like thinking in the back of your head, it's like, this is a manager position at a McDonald's, or at least equivalent to that. And you're going to tell me, and you're going to get intoxicated with power on that? And, a lot of people might say that that's just kind of evidence that power corrupts. But the thing is, if that's true, then you wouldn't have managers, you wouldn't have bosses, you wouldn't have people in any position of power. It's not true universally that power corrupts. Instead, I want to talk about something, because I'm a big fan of Friedrich Nietzsche. And a lot of the things is that, like, a lot of people kind of misunderstand Nietzsche, or even like some of the ideas around him. But one of the things I've noticed is like another talking point that we could probably, open up onto, is that it's not that power corrupts. I think it does something differently. I think it just reveals, because if power truly corrupted all, you would have no hierarchy whatsoever. You wouldn't have bosses. You wouldn't have people above you in any sense of capacity. And it would just be ungovernable. You would not have... universally all leaders would be bad, but that's not the case. Everybody's had good managers. Everybody's had good bosses, just like they've had bad bosses. And that's the thing, is that kind of negates the idea that power corrupts in its own right. Power doesn't corrupt. Power just shows you somebody's true character. And so hear me out. If you're still kind of on that train that power is the thing that corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Think about it this way, okay? If I were to give you the ability to have unchecked power to do whatever you wanted in the world, okay? And you could kill anybody you'd like. You could resurrect anybody from the dead. And all your actions that you did, you would have no consequences for any of your actions. Would you have any reason to hide who you really are at that point? When it comes to how people act, a lot of people save face. You know, they have three faces. There's a Japanese parable for this. You know, one face is basically for, you know, mass adoption, what they tell everybody. You know, the second face is for, the second mask is what you show to your friends and your close relatives. And the third face, the third mask, is something that nobody ever sees. It's something that's your true inner self that you've revealed to nobody for whatever reason. And everybody has that third face that they've never revealed to anybody. It's their deepest and darkest and truest, most authentic self. I would argue, and I've argued in previous videos, is that you see somebody's true and authentic self behind the mask of anonymity. It's because without the social repercussions about somebody giving their ideas, you know, without the pressure or the over-socialized nature of humanity to basically keep people in line, you get to understand who somebody is at their deepest level. When they have anonymity, when they have no repercussion to say what they're going to say. And yes, that's a double-edged sword. Some people, you know, obviously use that to troll, but a lot of people, you know, you really underestimate how anonymity allows somebody to reveal their true, authentic self. And power does the same thing. Power, absolute power, is what reveals somebody's true, authentic character. Not because it corrupts them. It just shows them, is because the fact is somebody with unchecked abilities, unchecked power over anything to do whatever they want. They have no reason to hide any of their desires, their wants. They're, you know, they might be a nasty person, you know, they might be a petty, vindictive person. And so maybe they were bullied a lot in high school. And, you know, so, you know, once they get like the first whiff of power, they're going to play out their power fantasy of being in the reverse role where they get to push people around, where they saw the bully that bullied them. And so now they have their power fantasy to enact what they, to others, what they have had done to them. Or some people, you know, they barely even remember that they have power in the first place, and they're just a mellow person. They just kind of sit there and they just kind of, you know, yeah, I'm going to use it sparingly to restore order into a social group, but I'm not going to, you know, use it, or it's not going to be a part of my core identity. It's just it's like, you know, a person that just kind of sits on his porch, but, you know, he's not really doing anything. He just has a big stick in case if anybody wants to threaten him. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, power affects everybody differently. Power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about in this video, is because it's something I've seen in so many people, especially in Christian morality. You know, when you read Friedrich Nietzsche and the genealogy of morality, you kind of understand why you have master morality and slave morality. Slave morality was the morality of people who are the oppressed, okay? And a lot of the times when you have slave morality, you have defiant oppositionalist morality, a morality that is designed in contradiction to the existing master morality. It's an inversion of the value set of the master morality. And so Christian morality began in ancient Rome, when ancient Rome and its religion, its gods, were gods of war, abundance, conquest, power. You know, these things, you know, the slaves of the Roman Empire, you know, saw these value systems. And so religion, you know, such as Christianity and, you know, the Abrahamic religions were an inversion of these values. Instead of conquering thy enemy, it was turn the other cheek. It was a pacifist religion. And it was more or less love thy neighbor and love thy enemy. You know, so the thing is, you have an inversion of these moralities. And so that's kind of the thing. You kind of recognize that. You recognize the morality that you've contended with this. And I'm not trying to say, oh, we need to go back to Roman master morality, but you understand how morality or moral systems evolve, and how that's the whole point of like the genealogy of morality, is how it logically evolves as an inversion of an existing moral system, as a direct contradiction. You could even say like modern fascist movements are just kind of, in a sort of way, you know, another slave morality that's rejecting the existing master morality that is Christianity. I mean, you could argue that the slave morality of the Roman Empire, you know, with Christianity of love thy neighbor and turn the cheek, and the pacifist, you know, morality that you see there was a contradictive morality to the existing morality of its time. And you could even argue that fascist morality, where it's about conquest power, is just more or less a defiant oppositionalism to the morality of the time that we have now, which is, you know, the last, God knows, 1,000 years of a Christian morality. Turn the other cheek, you know, yada, yada, yada. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. Maybe I'm just giving my 2 cents on what I think, you know, power is, you know, is that I'm not trying to say might is right, because that's obviously stupid. You know, a lot of the people who say might is right, you know, especially within these kinds of circles, you know, think the brute-fisted idiot Grug have big stick and that makes him right, okay? And the thing is that brute force strength doesn't really get you very far in the modern world where you have drone technology. And you could, of course, you might be able to act like a thug at one point or another, but then you probably, as soon as you hear the sound of a warring, drone, you're going to start calling somebody a coward and whining like a bitch because, you realize that brute fist and brute strength isn't really all that's needed in the modern world, right? And so when I'm not trying to make an excuse for that morality because it's stupid and retarded. What I'm trying to talk about is that power is not something that is good nor evil. I see power as a tool. Power is something that enables one to achieve what they want in life. And in a sort of sense, because when somebody escapes the consequences of the social hierarchy with power, like I said earlier, it just reveals who somebody really is. You could either be a petty, vindictive person. We've had people like that. As soon as they get the first inch of power, they're very manipulative, they're very vindictive, and they use it on everybody. And then you got the other person who just, they don't really use it very often unless it's really needed, and they've got to basically, do something to bring peace back into the group, or the mellow king, if you want to call it that. So, I wanted to talk about this for a little while now. And so, I want to ask you guys, your opinion. What do you think power is? Do you think it's something that corrupts? I personally don't think. And I always like to end every video because I like to ask other people, what do you think power is? Do you think it corrupts people? Do you think this is a benign thing? Or do you think it's just something that's absolutely malevolent and we need to abolish all hierarchies? I come from the political left. And so I know a lot of people, on the political left, especially anarchist circles, do not like the idea of hierarchies, power, centralization. A lot of their stuff is to dissolve these kinds of hierarchies. Obviously, I come from more of a materialist background, so I don't believe that's something that's eternal. I don't believe in a natural hierarchy, as people on the far right would. I believe in a utilitarian hierarchy that, forms on the basis of need and utility of any given circumstance. And when that circumstance is gone, that hierarchy is just kind of thrown to the side. And that's why I say I'm more of a materialist more than some kind of idealist that opposes it in either circumstance with the anarchist or the fascist. With that being said, if you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. What do you think power is? Do you think it's something that's evil, that corrupts people, or do you think it's something that is, benign? It's just something that reveals more than it does corrupt. Well, I'm going to go ahead and close off the video. Y'all have a good night.